I'm delighted to welcome back at a very opportune moment Timothy Ash, who's been a professional economist for more than 30 years, with two-thirds of that in the banking industry. Timothy's specialism is emerging European economies, and he writes and blogs extensively on the economic challenges for leading publications such as the Kyiv Post, Atlantic Council, Financial Times, and so on. He is also an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasian program at Chatham House, and he has advised various governments on the policy around sanctions. We're going to start with that because there's a huge news, of course, that is being billed as a major sea change, that is oil sanctions. The UK actually announced similar sanctions, I believe it was a week or so ago, and now the US has followed suit and are encouraging Europe to do the same. We're going to dive in though. Are they really effective? Are they all that they are billed? And is the Kremlin genuinely scared by them, or is it yet another case of smoke and mirrors? Timothy, welcome back.
No, thank you. Great to be here again.
And to remind people, you are a regular on the channel and one, I think, of our most impassioned and informed speakers. So I'm delighted we could get you at this pivotal moment. Could you start by diving into these oil sanctions? Are they significant, or do we have to dig into the details to find that actually they may not have the impact that we hope for, which has been the story of sanctions perhaps over the last almost 4 years?
Yeah. Well, look, my initial take was possibly not just because the UK had sanctioned Lukoil and Rosneft the week before, and there hadn't been much impact. And then subsequently, actually, the oil price rallied. Actually, it went up 4 or 5% on the back of it. I mean, maybe that says quite a lot about how seriously the world and the market takes the UK actually, and its ability to police the sanctions that it's rolled out. I think a few things of note with respect to the US sanctions, in particular on Rosneft and Lukoil. Firstly, there's a 4-week implementation phase. This is Donald Trump, and he does flip-flop. So there is possibly still a risk, I guess, that he has a change of heart and Putin does something, reaches out to him, and we see him delaying implementation, which is kind of a possibility. I mean, assuming that is not the case and they are rolled out, and then obviously a lot depends on implementation and secondary sanctions or sanctions imposed to police, these particular sanctions. So basically, secondary sanctions on companies that still want to do business with Rosneft and Lukoil and other Russian entities that have already been sanctioned, right? I mean, unfortunately, the experience so far in the 3.5 years, actually almost a decade, if you go back to the first imposition of sanctions after the annexation of Crimea, sanctions on Russia. Unfortunately, secondary sanctions have been pretty weak. Enforcement has been pretty weak. We've given Russia lots of time and opportunity to get around the sanctions. Obviously, we've had the evolution of the shadow fleet, which has been one of the key ways in which Russia has avoided the existing sanctions on waterborne oil exports from Russia. So, look, I mean, it depends on that. I mean, there are lots of still moving parts. Initially the market was surprised, I think, because they'd assumed, like myself, that Trump wasn't serious about doing anything particularly on Russia, and this came out of the blue a bit, and everyone's taken aback a bit. But we'll have to see. I mean, the noise initially from certainly the Indians and the Chinese has been pretty cautious, right? I mean, both have suggested that they will, in fact, row back and reduce their imports from Russia. They're worried, obviously, about secondary sanctions, particularly banks that facilitate this trade. So that's good news if that's the reality, right? I mean, that will squeeze Russia. It will mean that it will be more costly for Russia to try and get around these sanctions. It'll have to offer a discount, a more significant discount for individuals or companies or whatever, or countries that still want to trade with it, to make it worth their while and make them risk running the secondary sanctions gauntlet of the West. So if Trump's serious, if there's proper enforcement, this will further withhold revenues to the Russian state. It will make it more difficult for Russia to wage this war. It will impose additional costs on the Russian economy and the Russian population. I mean, that's the hope anyway.
And of course, this is the first thing, perhaps, in the full-scale war that has deterred or may deter China and India from the purchase of crude. And of course, the re-export in India's case of refined oil products, which one would imagine is generating enormous, enormous profits, at least for a few people. We know that secondary sanctions under Biden have had some deterrence power on China in terms of its lending to sort of commercial and private entities in Russia. So it seems that secondary sanctions can have an impact. But is this the first time that we're seeing any movement on oil, which is, of course, crucial to Russia's war machine?
Well, look, I mean, Europe in particular and the West wanted to cut Russian energy out of its energy supply chain, right? I mean, firstly, Russia had held Europe blackmail in the period in the lead up to the full-scale invasion, and then afterwards, trying to use energy to enforce its geopolitical objectives, right? So Europe wanted to reduce that vulnerability, right? So we saw efforts to cut, to ban actually not just oil and gas, but coal, seaborne crude oil deliveries were banned in Europe, and we've been reducing pipeline gas and obviously pipeline oil, and the European Union suggested they're going to cut, I think by 2027. Russian pipeline oil and gas out of the kind of chain. I guess then the second part of it, I mean, you reduce your own vulnerability to this blackmail, and secondly, you want to reduce the revenue flows to Russia. That's more difficult, obviously, because if you stop Russia's exports onto global markets, you increase global energy, you create a shortage, you increase global energy prices, and actually you may well increase revenue flows to Russia. So the Biden administration, were wanted to divert, exports from Europe somewhere else. The Indians and the Chinese took advantage of that. India, which wasn't particularly a large importer of Russian energy, started to buy lots of Russian oil at discounted prices. The oil price cap, if you remember the $60 a barrel oil price cap that the European Union imposed a year or so back, massively helped the Indians, and likely they benefited, in tens of billions of dollars of cheap energy. Good for India. I mean, you could argue that it was worth profiteering. Maybe the Ukrainians would argue that, but at least it prevented a disruption of global energy markets, which could have been a systemic global problem, and obviously may have been counterproductive in terms of it would have enabled Russia to actually earn more revenues if prices had been increased. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting this time around with both Indian and Chinese companies pulling back from buying Russian energy. Much has been made of the fact that the timing is somewhat opportune in terms of oil prices have moderated quite significantly. I mean, obviously, because of tariffs, global growth has slowed down, demand for energy is reduced, there's more supply come on stream, and there's a surplus of something like around 3.5 million barrels a day of oil. The Saudis obviously have lots of excess production. Maybe there's a deal between Trump and the Saudis to take Russian market share, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia itself, MBS still has very ambitious reform objectives, Vision 2030. It's very, NEOM and these big projects are very expensive. Oil prices going from an average of $80 a barrel under the Biden administration to something like 60 now really hurts the Saudis, right? The budget deficits increase, they're going to have to borrow more. So, if the Saudis can make up for that lower oil price by bringing more supply to the market and taking Russian oil off the market, it's kind of a win-win. And obviously, Trump is eager to work with Saudi Arabia in terms of the Middle East peace process. So maybe there's a deal behind the scenes there that somehow can freeze the Russians out. Let's hope so, because in the end, all this is about reducing the revenue stream to Russia, as I mentioned, making sure the Russian war machine is not as well funded as it is at the moment.
And one suspects via Jared Kushner there are a lot more connections than just via the peace process, properties, deals, various other opportunities which could be attractive there. Now, here I'm going to ask a sort of slightly cheeky question here because as we have the hybrid war intensifying, and I have no doubt that it will intensify further in Europe, it may even reach the US. An interesting article by Keir Giles that was picked up by I think the Washington Post on that sort of topic. It starts to get more existential. So as well as these sort of overt methods of cutting Russian oil out, is it possible that we might start to see some countries, naming no names, resort to covert means? And in particular, again, sort of this is highly speculative, but in 3 days we had rumors of three refinery accidents in Hungary, Romania, and possibly Slovakia, although there's no hard and fast evidence of that yet. What links all three is that they were all handling Russian crude. Now, I'm not saying that these were covert, but is it possible that covert means Nord Stream type activities could become more likely as a result if we don't see movement on shutting Russian out?
Well, the irony, really, in terms of in recent weeks and months, Trump has been resisting doing more sanctions on Russia. And the argument's been, look at Europe; it's importing all this Russian energy. Let's wait for Europe to move first. And the irony is that the countries that are importing most Russian energy are actually friends of Putin, like Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia, right? So, the European Union is saying yes, yes, we're very eager to stop Russian energy imports, but then, again, Orban and Fico have been saying we can't do it. Technically, it's possible, right? From what I understand, Hungary can get oil supplies through Croatia, that's LNG, maybe bought from the Americans, but LNG, and actually already the gas transit has, I think, more or less stopped. I mean, the Ukrainians stopped that. There's been a lot of tax on Ukrainian gas transit, gas supply, and production in Ukraine. It's physically possible for those countries, technically possible for those countries to stop imports of Russian energy. They argue that it's just going to be more expensive, right? So I presume they're looking for some kind of bailout from the European Union for that. That's typical of Orban. He criticizes the European Union. Meanwhile, Hungary's been a recipient of tens, actually hundreds of billions of euros in EU structural fund flows. So, he wants his cake and he wants to eat it, I think. Yes, and you mentioned the attacks on energy infrastructure. The Ukrainians, in their attacks on Russia proper, have been increasingly successful, right, in recent months. There's a lot of focus, I think, on the fact that the war in Ukraine is something of a stalemate. Actually, it feels a little bit like, we could be at something of a turning point. In terms of, for me, one of the sides could get a technological advantage here, right? It's about innovation. It's not a war of attrition, it's a war of iteration, right? Which side gets the technological advantage, particularly in drones and counter-drone warfare? And it looks like the Ukrainians have got something of an advantage now in this deep strike drones, right? They're increasingly successful in hitting Russian refinery production. They've probably hit something like 30% of Russian facilities, taken off stream something like a fifth. That's hurting Russia, definitely. We're seeing queues at the gas stations, higher prices for refined products domestically. The Russians have stopped exports of some refined products, which again shows the difficulties they're in. Now, the challenge for Ukraine, they may have found drones that have a much higher success rate. Their challenge will be going to scale, right? It's identifying drones and technology that works in terms of hitting Russian facilities, but then scaling it up, going from tens produced a day to hundreds, thousands produced a day that can have a seismic impact on Russia. I tend to think that Russia's actions in the last month or so of escalation in terms of its forays, either with drones or MiG-31s into airspace of NATO countries, reflects the fact that the Ukrainians have been increasingly successful at hitting Russia at home, particularly refineries, right? So I think the Russians are looking more vulnerable than they've been for a long time, right? The economy is weaker. Definitely, the Ukrainians have identified vulnerabilities, particularly in terms of refineries. And now we have, this latest action with the Lukoil Rosneft sanctions that, if properly rolled out, again, could be pretty important. And then there's all the frozen Russian asset stuff, which we've had less good news, I guess, over the last 24 hours in terms of what's been going on in
It's
Brussels.
been delayed, hasn't it? Not everyone will be aware, but the what
Yes,
is nominally a very interesting scheme has once again been kicked, maybe not into the long grass, but
yes, frustrating. Obviously, I've written, and I think we've spoken quite a lot on this podcast. We were hopeful that a scheme would be worked out where the Russian taxpayer would be made to pay for the war in Ukraine rather than Western taxpayers, and we could use the $330 billion of immobilized Russian assets in Western jurisdictions. The Europeans came up with this reparation loan idea that fell short of full confiscation. The
but
Belgians.
it does cover the funds though, doesn't it? So
No, I
actually,
mean, look,
it's
yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, if we can figure out the details of it, it it definitely covers the financing shortfall that Ukraine likely faces in the next year or two because the Americans have stepped back in terms of financing. Remember, the Americans were providing about 40% of the $100 billion a year of annual financing to keep Ukraine in the war. Without the Americans, the Europeans will have to cover that shortfall. It's a lot of money. European countries face very difficult fiscal positions. UK, for example, I mean Rachel Reeves in the UK is having to find either spending cuts or increased taxes to cover a big financing shortfall. I don't think there's appetite in the UK to suddenly double its £5 billion a year contribution to Ukraine, and it's the same across Europe. Right? Look at the French fiscal position, domestic politics in France. So I don't think there's appetite from taxpayers in Europe to pay more. And when there's this Russian taxpayer money sitting doing nothing in bank accounts, I just think there's no alternative. So I think, the Belgians have kind of pushed back a bit. They have concerns about sharing liability or sharing the risks, I should say, in a very unlikely scenario where Russia takes legal action to recover the funds. The Belgians say, well, actually, the risk should be shared across Europe and G7. That's fair.
that sounds fair, yeah.
It's a little bit surprising in my mind that other European countries have not raised their hands and said, yes, that's a reasonable thing
Yeah.
to ask for. Let's go and do it. The point's been made that countries don't want to be on the hook. They don't want their taxpayers to be on the hook for hundreds of billions of dollars if these funds are used down the line. The counter I'd make to it is, well, the alternative is the taxpayer has to pay hundreds of billions of dollars now, right? So I don't get the logic of our politicians, right? They think it's better to spend hundreds of billions of dollars of our taxpayer money now to set against the possible risk, a very low risk in my mind, that 30 years from now, when this reparation loan falls due, the Russian state may come in knocking at the door saying, actually, we want all this money back. It seems perverse, right? But I think, in the end, a deal will be done. And I think it will be done this year because there is no alternative.
Because there's something like a 50 billion euro hole in Ukraine's finances for the conceivable future annual budget, and this kind of fairly neatly fits that over the next sort of 2 to 3 years. I'm guessing that if we are going to increase our own funding, we would prefer to sink that into the Ukrainian defense industry and into co-run projects that simultaneously improve our defensive stance at the same time.
No, absolutely. Look, 330 billion covers Ukraine's financing needs for 2 to 3 years. It sends a really strong message to Putin that Ukraine's well funded. It can sustain itself in this war for a very long time. It changes the calculus for Putin himself. As you mentioned, we should be very innovative in how we use this money. I argued just prior in terms of the challenge will be, taking the best innovation that we've seen from the Ukrainians in terms of these deep strike and getting to scale, right? Scale production that costs money. If you produce the scale in Ukraine, there are lots of issues. The corruption issue has always been there, but the risks of Russia hitting Ukrainian drone manufacturing facilities. So it makes some sense for this finance to be used to fund manufacture of drones in scale in NATO countries. And the big advantage is that we get, the technology exchange. We learn best practice from the Ukrainians. I guess those Russian forays of drones into NATO airspace over the last month or so has just underlined the absence of drone defense in Europe, and the fact that actually we're dependent on the Ukrainians for our defense already, right? All those countries that has been subject to those drone attacks are now asking the Ukrainians to help them in terms of drone defense, right? So, it's really, really important, I think, that we coordinate finance, scale production, and innovation with the Ukrainians to help our own defense. In the UK in particular, the Starmer government announced, I think, a plan to produce create 6 munitions factories. I'm not sure finance is available for those, but a good idea would be to use some of the £25 billion of immobilized Russian assets in the UK to maybe, for at least build one of those factories in cooperation with the Ukrainians to produce drones for Ukraine and for the UK military, right? I mean, it would seem like a no-brainer, but sometimes things that seem obvious and a no-brain solution, it takes our governments many months or years to do the obvious.
And here's an added complexity here, which I think is difficult for planners, bureaucrats, and dare I say even economists to sort of to really sort of calculate or even get their heads around. And that is that it isn't just an investment in hardware. And it seems that from some recent reports and speaking to Ukrainians of my acquaintance in the tech industry, we are starting to copy the physical manifestation, which is starting to produce and plan for the products, the drones themselves. But the Ukrainian point here is that this is not just a manufacturing and supply question, which can be solved by money. It's a culture, it's a process, it's a system of innovation and training and implementation and communication, which is far, far harder to emulate and actually impossible to do unless you're plugged into the Ukrainian ecosystem and indeed testing your products almost in real time and iterating them in real time in a wartime situation. That is going to be quite challenging for our procurement systems and culture.
No, I mean, I think we can probably both talk about the UK defence procurement experience, right? I mean, there's been a long, long track record of disasters. I remember the replacement for the Nimrod aeroplane. I mean, battlefield communication systems, you name it. The UK has been terrible in many of these, really big defence procurement projects. We can learn a lot from the Ukrainians, I think, right? And it is extraordinary what the UK can do in a short period of time in terms of getting supplies to the Ukrainians that we can't actually get to our own military in the same kind of time frame, right? So, needs must in extraordinary times of danger and peril, things happen, right? So, but yes, I mean, look, clearly what's happening in Ukraine is the frontier of warfare, our future battles, future warfare, our own defense. I think, what goes on in Ukraine, our own defense will be determined by what goes on in Ukraine. We need to learn really fast from that. And I think, I think UK military and European militaries and NATO militaries, I think, are trying their best to figure out what's going on in Ukraine. But it's very fast moving, right? I mean, a drone that may well be very successful this week may not work next week because the Russians figure out some kind of countermeasure against it, right? So again, it's a war of iteration, as I mentioned, right? And I guess the danger a little bit is, it feels a little bit like First World War, late First World War, maybe like 1917, invention of the tank, where, some invention could fundamentally shape the battlefield in favor of one or the other combatants. And it feels at the moment that Ukraine has that technological advantage, but it doesn't have the scale advantage. Russia has the scale; it's producing Shahed drones in huge numbers. So again, it's about finance, innovation, and scale. And we're kind of failing at the moment. We need to do more to help the Ukrainians, and the immobilized Russian assets would have, really helped the Ukrainians scale up pretty quickly. And again, I think we'll see a solution towards the end of the year, but we're going to waste 2 months again. 2 months is critical in this war.
Absolutely. It costs innumerable lives, and not just lives, those are people with incredible battlefield experience, which is often irreplaceable. In this bit, we're going to turn to, before we hit record, I described an event I went to. I won't mention who was on the contrary side of the argument, but basically it was an event where they were discussing whether sanctions have a role in the foreign policy toolkit and whether they work at all. And an excellent case was made by Edward Lucas and Tom Keating about why they do work and why they could do better, etc. I won't name and shame the people on the other side of the argument, but it did raise some interesting questions, especially ones which I'm not saying these people in any way were aligned with Russia or their narratives, but we see cruder versions of these arguments come up all the time. And the one that startled me most was when the speakers were asked whether this could lead to World War III. The diplomat who was arguing that we should drop all sanctions said that we are already in World War III if you look at it in the economic sphere. This already is a global economic conflagration. Is that hyperbole, or is there an argument that could be made for that? And do Russians see it as that in their, fairly paranoid, let's say, political state?
Well, I think it's clear the Russians do, right? I mean, their narrative is that they're at war with NATO and Ukraine, right? I mean, that's their story. Do sanctions work? I always use the case of going way back, 2014, annexation of Crimea and the first imposition of sanctions by the West on Russia. Around April 14, I seem to remember, right? April to sort of June, July, that period. And if you remember that time, the Russians didn't expect any sanction after the annexation of Crimea, right? They were taken aback. And I do think that in that period between April and later in the year, the Russians were minded to have a much larger scale military intervention in Donbass, right? And at that point in time, the Ukrainian military were almost defenseless, which was, reflecting the fact that Crimea was taken in a couple of days, right? In the whole Donbass area, I don't think the Ukrainians would have been able to put up much of a better defense. What happened is the Russians delayed their eventual intervention in Donbass to kind of June, July that year, 2014, right? It gave the Ukrainians critical months to rejig, rebuild their defenses and get ready for what they knew was going to be inevitable, which is this Russian military intervention later that year, right? And it was sanctions that I think put the Russians on the back foot, made them, and if you remember, April 14, Russian markets got really badly impacted, right? Again, because people didn't expect it, right? And so I would say that's a specific example of sanctions actually working, particularly in Ukraine's favor at that point in time. And, if Ukraine hadn't been given that couple of months to better defend itself, the battlefield may have looked very different, right? I mean, Russian troops could have carved through large swathes of Ukraine in that period. So again, that's my personal reflection on that period. I may be wrong, but I certainly I looked at Ukraine in a lot of detail in that period. That's my view and my understanding, right?
Some deterrence power, at least. And of course, if we use Magnitsky sanctions as an example as well, we know that they had both a shocking and a painful effect at the time because Russian propagandists were so completely livid about, being held to any account for their impunity.
No, sure. Look, I mean, let's say on the sanctions piece, initially they were imposed by the West to get Russia to change its actions, right? Get out of Crimea, get out of Donbass, and then obviously after full-scale invasion, stop the full-scale invasion and pull back. If those commentators are right, if we're in World War III in effect already, I would actually argue that now the logic for sanctions goes beyond those initial desires, motivations to kind of stop Russia's actions. I think we have an interest now in weakening the Russian economy, keeping it weak, preventing Russia from regenerating its military capability lost in Ukraine, right? So we should keep sanctions in place as long as Russia remains a threat to us and Europe, right? And I do think, the sanctions in place are weakening Russia's economy. They are making it, they are reducing the export value of goods Russia exports. They're increasing the cost of imports. They're reducing the merchandise trade surplus and current account surplus, the accumulation of foreign exchange reserves that Russia then uses to buy imports to sustain the war machine, right? So, I think that for me is now probably the imperative in terms of why we should keep sanctions in place, right? Because Russia is clearly a threat to Ukraine, but it's a threat to European security. I mean, it has a track record. Litvinenko, Salisbury, the country that's used weapons of mass destruction on European streets is Russia, right? Extraordinary. What it is doing on a hybrid warfare, the drone activity, closing European airports, attacks on infrastructure. Russia has a problem with us, our system of government. He has a problem with Europe, right? So now, yes, sanctions have been less effective than they could have been. I would say that's more about implementation and then policing. Implementation, we've been far too slow. It's been sanctioned by the highest common denominator. We've allowed countries and companies to lobby for carve-outs because of their own particular interests. National security interests have been subordinate to commercial interests. In terms of making sure everyone is on board to send a unified political signal, again, it's given Russia's lots of time to figure out ways to get around sanctions. And then in terms of enforcement, right, secondary sanctions have been too weak. We've done very little to impose any cost on individuals, corporates, and countries helping Russia break sanctions. UK is a great case in point. Who has gone to jail in the UK for helping Russia break sanctions? No one. Has there been any penalty imposed on anyone in the UK breaking sanctions? None. And there are plenty of cases where sanctions busters have been identified in the UK, right? So it pays to help Russia break sanctions. I mean, are we idiots?
And there are legal loopholes as well. I don't know whether this is verified, but I saw a chart, and I've seen plenty of these charts with people berating Germany, but this is the first chart I saw about the UK, and it showed the drop in UK direct exports to Russia, which did collapse in February 2022, but it showed a commensurate rise in exports via Kazakhstan and Central Asia. So are we as bad as anybody else in Europe in our sort of hypocrisy? And I guess that's legal. I mean, that's not illegal to carry on those trades via third parties.
Well, again, we've adopted a softly approach to third countries, whether it's Turkey, Central Asia, Gulf states, Dubai, etc. I mean, I guess we could have gone hardball on those countries, imposing aggressive secondary sanctions. I guess the decision was we didn't want to force those countries into Russia's orbit, right? I would say that if that's the case, we're not confident enough in our own economic muscle and strength, right? I don't think, it's a great economic offering to Turkey, for example, or Dubai, etc., that you will lose all your business with the Western world if you continue to help Russia break sanctions. And good luck if you think you can survive being wholly reliant on the Russian market, right? Just think about this. Russia is a 1.2 roughly $1 trillion economy. And the West combined is 60 trillion, multiples, 50 odd times larger than the Russian economy. All those countries and that have decided it's good business to help Russia break sanctions. Maybe they'd change their mind if they got cut off themselves from trading with that $60 trillion part of the global economy.
Absolutely. And turning back to this diplomat, and I'm not maligning diplomats per se, because I've got some fantastic acquaintances who are extremely strong on Ukraine. But he made one interesting point, and one point, or the absence of point, which I found disturbing. One point he made, that the foreign policy has failed because it doesn't have an objective. Therefore, sanctions, no matter how rigorous they are going to fail because they're not tied to a particular output, a particular result that we want to see from them. And that seems actually to tie in with what people like Ben Hodges say as well, is that we're militarily failing in our support for Ukraine, again, because we haven't defined the objective. The absence in his argument was where he argued that sanctions be withdrawn because they're failing. There was no mention whatsoever that actually, even if the sanctions are largely ineffective, they still have the effect of reducing the revenue to the Russian war machine, and that can be translated directly into Ukrainian lives saved because there are things Russia couldn't do, which they otherwise would have done without revenue. That sort of moral human argument was not made at all, which I found shocking. But the idea of not defining an outcome, that seemed quite powerful.
Well, as I mentioned previously, an outcome for us is making sure the Russian economy is weak so it can't regenerate military capability to be used against us, right? It's in our defense interests to keep Russia weak. And in terms of defined outcomes, I mean, Trump seems to be pretty specific right now in terms of he's not happy with Putin not being serious when he turns up to summits, and not being serious in terms of negotiations, right? So yes, let's ramp up sanctions on Russia until we get Russia to the negotiating table, right? I mean, that seems a logical, very defined, quantifiable KPI for sanctions, right? So, but in the end, we haven't done enough, right? We've been too slow, too predictable. We haven't done enough in terms of enforcement. I think that's the major problem, rather than having very, very well-defined KPIs from the sanctions regime we have in place.
And there's just two more questions, but it's 1,000 questions really. But there's just two more because I know your time is incredibly precious. One of them, of course, is really interesting. I think this is where many people have sort of failed to understand. When they think of sanctions, they think of it applying pressure to the regime, yes, but then they think of it applying pressure to oligarchs, as if oligarchs had some separate and independent power, as if they weren't an integral part of the system and machine, even, dare I say it, just sort of cogs in that machine. So there's this idea almost baked into a lot of the sort of diplomatic and analytical understanding that you have the regime, and then you have powerful individuals, and you have an elite. I think if you speak to someone like, Keir Giles, who say, well, that's really not it. These are not independent people. So by targeting oligarchs, you are targeting the regime in an extremely direct sense.
Well, I don't think any oligarch could have survived in Russia under the Putin administration, certainly since the second term of Putin, without doing deals and business and bowing to the Putin himself, right? I
Well,
mean,
since Khodorkovsky, I think the writing was on the wall from that very moment. There was the confrontation that destroyed Khodorkovsky.
yeah, I mean, large Russian businesses and oligarchs are instruments of the Russian state, right? I have no doubt in my mind that that's the case, and they've had plenty of opportunities. Oligarchs and the Russian population. I mean, a lot of people suggest it's just Putin, this mad guy but unfortunately, the war in Ukraine is popular amongst the Russian masses, right? And I think Timothy Schneider terms it quite well, or makes a very strong, compelling case that Russians, unfortunately, still have an imperial mindset. They think they're they have a right to an empire and a sphere of influence, and a bit like, and Schneider argues, the UK used to have that mindset until Suez, and we realized that actually we couldn't sustain an empire, and we had to start giving it back, and it changed our perceptions in the world, and possibly Russia needs to suffer a similar defeat to change its mindset that it doesn't have a right to invade and intervene in other countries' politics and take other countries' territory. And it's the destabilizing force in Europe. It's the country that is invading other countries. I mean, NATO enlarges because countries decide they'd rather like to join NATO because they're fearful of Russian invasion. I mean, that's the harsh reality, right? Maybe if Russia stopped invading other countries, the desire to join NATO would moderate somewhat.
And indeed, people forget that the 90s, Russia had a role as a guest at NATO, with a view that we would guarantee Russia's borders itself to get out of this sort of cycle of paranoia. I think that's something people forget. The last one here, and I think this is, we've had these conversations before, and there's an extremely strong moral strand that I think comes through in all your arguments, which is then translated into the language of economic leverage. But something that was curiously absent, I think, in that diplomat's argumentation was this idea that sometimes we have to take on costs. Sometimes we have to burden huge costs and pain because neutrality has a cost as well. Neutrality has a cost of tainting us, especially when it comes to the taint of Russian money. It's corrosive to our institutions, to our values, and sometimes taking a financial hit is better than the corrosion that will happen when you let that money sort of seep into your system.
Well, you raised a number of interesting kind of issues there. Firstly, sanctions are not cost free. They hurt the target, but they also hurt us. And for them to be effective, we have to be willing to pay a price, right? You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, unfortunately. But if we deem the threat from Russia sufficiently severe, then we have to be prepared to pay the cost, right? And interestingly, if you think about it, I mean, if we'd have taken the threat from Russia seriously enough early enough, and we'd have either increased sanctions very aggressively very early, we may have made Putin think twice about his actions after the annexation of Crimea. But the consequences of that is now we're living with this war, which is costing Europe $100 billion a year, and we're going to have to increase defence spending. Obviously, there's a decision made to go from 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP. Just let's think about this, right? That move from 2 to 5% of GDP in Europe will cost €1 trillion in additional defence spending. So that's what we've committed to do, because actually we've misread Russia for the last 20 years, right? And we failed to impose sanctions on Russia to change Russia's behavior early enough because we weren't willing to bear that cost, right? And now we're having to spend €1 trillion a year, or that's where we will be in a decade's time if we end up having to meet the NATO 5% GDP defense spend. And I would say, if Ukraine loses this war, we'll have to go to 5% of GDP much quicker than is assumed by NATO, again, to get to that €1,000 trillion of additional defense spend, right?
So, or a direct confrontation, then you're looking at unimaginable costs. I mean, Ukraine has, I think, at the moment, 60% of their budget is spent on defense at this point in time.
Yeah, no, multiples of that. And again, you raised that raises an interesting question about why we didn't take the threat from Russia seriously early enough. And I do think that we were infiltrated, frankly. Again, Putin always knew this was going to happen. right? He's always had a mindset that he saw Russia as in war or conflict or competition with NATO and the West in particular. And, Russian companies, Russian oligarchs, Russian individuals, infiltrated their way into our system, right? And, ask yourself why someone like Abramovich bought Chelsea Football Club, right? It's to, investment in our universities, or the number of individuals employed by international banks to give the view on Russia from those banks, right? Very often we got the view of Russia from Russians.
Yes. Or their proxies. Yeah.
Or actually, when someone stood up and said something that the Kremlin didn't like, there was a lot of lobbying by Russian business to freeze those people out, right? Or, Russian oligarchs buying Western media again to give this view, to ensure that the view given of Russia was the wrong one, right? That Russia wasn't a threat, and clearly now it was, right? Unfortunately, that's the reality.
But we have to look at the, let's say, the harassment of someone like Jessica Ara, who was a very early critic, when there were very few voices actually critiquing Putin. And they threw a lot of resources to discredit and try to destroy individuals who were seeking to chip away at that impression.
I'll give you an example just before I end that. I worked for a Western bank around the time of the annexation of Crimea. And at the time, I was highlighting that I thought the little green men were Russians, right? And we got a phone call, and a Russian state-owned energy company decided they wanted to come to see the bank and ask me where I got my views from. And it was clearly intimidation. It's, they were using their market power, the fact that this bank valued the relationship with this Russian energy company. And, there was a fear of a loss of business in reality if I continued to write these things about Russia. That was just me, one individual. I'm sure that happened across the board, right? That Russian business, finance, oligarchs, used their power and influence to shape opinion and dominate opinion in the West to a certain view, which, was this view that Russia's not a threat, Russia's not a malign actor, and that's clearly not the case.
Yeah. And people will be shocked to find. I mean, I didn't have a YouTube channel back then, but when Skripal was poisoned, and I jumped on to social media to immediately say, well, and the same with Litvinenko, it's obvious who's done it. Not only did I have some rather curious trolls chasing after me, which must have been expensive for somebody to organize, I then got a rather curious offer to co-found a travel agency, bringing elite Russians to the UK. And that's me. I know absolute nobody, but that's some people I used to know suddenly reached out of the blue. Deeply, deeply suspicious. So yeah, they're prepared to spend and expend huge resources to try and get voices to amplify their nonsense. Again, massive pleasure. We've covered a few, I think, absolutely critical topics there, and brought the spectre of morality into economics, which I'm always sort of pleased to inject that there. Thank you so much for coming back on, especially at short notice, to cover the breaking stories around oil sanctions and to put your perspective on it. And I look forward, of course, to the next time. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Great to speak to you.
Бажаємо міцного здоров'я. Ми бійці батальйону безпілотних систем Black Raven 93-ї бригади Холодний Яр виконуємо бойове завдання на Константинівському напрямку в Донецькій області. Для їх успішного виконання наш підрозділ має потребу в пікапах для виїзду особового складу на позиції, евакуації, своєчасного підвозу боєприпасів, дронів та обладнання в район ведення бойових дій. Звертаємося до YouTube-спільноти Silicon Curtain та Джонатана особисто з проханням допомогти підтримати збір, а також до Car for Ukraine та Бандера-Мобіль з проханням допомогти з купівлею, підготовкою та доставкою авто на фронт. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!